is Eli Morgan, and if you're reading this, I only ask one thing. Don't pity me. I don't want compassion. I want you to understand, to see how someone like me got here, and maybe, just maybe, realize that evil isn't always born monstrous. Sometimes it's shaped, day after day, brick by brick, in the place you least expect. I was left on a winter's morning at the door of St. Michael's Home for Boys in Youngstown, Ohio, wrapped in thin cloths, inside a wicker basket. No letter, no clue. Just silence. They called me Eli because it was the shortest name the social worker could remember that night. She said I looked small and scared like the prophet. I grew up thinking it was a joke that nobody understood. The orphanage wasn't the kind of place that appears in adoption commercials, with colorful walls and smiling children. It was damp. It always smelled of reheated soup and mold. The windows let in the cold as if it were invited, and the adults pretended not to hear when someone cried at night. Life inside was a survival field, and I was the easiest target. I was always skinny, quiet, with a downcast gaze. The kind of child that attracts cruelty like light attracts moths. The king of the food chain inside was a boy named Connor Velasquez, 3 years older than me and twice my size. He and his guard dogs loved to see me suffer. They pushed me in the corridors. They stole anything I tried to hide, an apple, an old book, a clean sock. Sometimes they slapped me on the head just to see if I cried. I never reacted. Never. Not because I was calm, but because fear paralyzed me inside. It was as if my soul became too small to leave my body. And the adults? They saw. They knew. But they pretended not to. It was easier to pretend that boys like Connor were going through problems, and that boys like me needed to learn to defend themselves. I learned, but not the way they wanted. At 10 years old, I saw a man die for the first time. An electrician came to fix the wiring upstairs. He climbed the ladder, fiddled with a panel, and boom, a dry bang, a smell of burning, a body lying on the floor, eyes open, mouth too, as if he had seen his own end coming head-on. The caregivers screamed. The children cried. Some ran. Others fainted. Me? I just kept looking, not out of morbid curiosity, nor out of coldness. I just didn't feel anything. Nothing but a silent calm that seemed wrong. I remember staring at the body for long minutes until one of the staff pulled me away roughly and said, "This is not something for you to see, Eli." But I had already seen it, and I never forgot. That night, lying in bed, I entered an even deeper silence. While the other boys cried or pretended to sleep, I thought, so that's how it ends. That fast? It was the first time I understood that death is just another muffled sound in the middle of chaos. And in a way there, still small, I began to like the idea. After the electrician, nothing seemed real anymore. The other boys cried for weeks. Connor, the bully, even pretended to be shaken. But it was all a facade. Only I knew that what happened there was a sign that death doesn't choose. It just passes. And I understood something that no one else understood. Not being afraid of death is like carrying an invisible weapon. And when you live in a place like St. Michael's, that's power. It was around the age of 12 that everything started to change. Connor tried to knock me down in the refectory once. He pushed me and waited for me to cower. But this time I stood up. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "If you touch me again, she's coming to get you." He laughed. Of course he laughed. But at night, I waited. I spread a story among the boys. I said there was a spirit in the orphanage, one that appeared when someone hurt her protected ones. I spoke in detail about the lights flickering before something bad happened, about the smell of burning that came from nowhere, about the sound of dragging footsteps. I spoke calmly, convinced, without smiling, and deep down, I wanted to believe it too. 2 days later, Connor fell down the emergency stairs. He fractured his wrist. He said he slipped, but I swore I heard him whispering in the hallway. I saw a shadow before, and the legend was born there. Every time someone threatened me, a new story emerged. And by coincidence or luck, or something else, Things always went wrong for those who touched me. A twisted ankle, a cockroach infestation in the closet, a tooth pulled out when biting a stone in the rice. And I kept saying, "She is with me." The boys stopped laughing at me. They even stopped looking at me. I became a living legend among traumatized children. But everything has a price. I wanted respect. I got fear. I wanted friends. I got silence. And when the social worker appeared with a couple interested in adoption, she didn't even call me for the interview. She said the parents preferred a more sociable child. At 15, I was the shadowy boy in the back dormitory, the one who whispered stories at midnight, the one who had visions, the one who talked to someone that no one saw. Connor left at 18. He left me a gift, a scar on my forehead that I carry to this day. He pushed me into a wall on the last day just to have the last word. He smiled and said, "Death doesn't want you, failure. You're going to die here alone." And I believed it, until the day I was kicked out, without ceremony, without a farewell. They gave me a backpack with used clothes and a $20 meal voucher, and they threw me into the world. I spent the first night sleeping in a shelter, then on a bench in the train station, until I found the old iron gate with the words Ash Grove Memorial Cemetery stamped at the top. I don't know why, but I went in, and I never left. Ash Grove Memorial Cemetery. The iron of the gate was cold, damp with dew, and even though I no longer believed in signs, something made me go in there that morning. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe the fact that no one stopped me. Or maybe because that was already written. I wandered among the tombstones like someone seeking shelter in a labyrinth of other people's memories. I sat down near a twisted tree and closed my eyes. I thought I could sleep. But I didn't sleep. Something was watching me. That's when I heard dragging footsteps in the gravel. I jumped up in fright. A man, brown suit, lantern in hand, tall, thin, with sunken eyes like wells. "The cemetery is closed, kid." I explained everything, that I had no home, nor anyone, and that I just needed a corner until the sun rose. He looked at me in silence, and just said, "Are you hungry?" He took me to a simple house next to the cemetery. Old wood, yellowish lamps. He served me hot soup and stale bread. It was the best dinner of my life. His name was Mr. Malcolm. Gravedigger for 35 years, widower, alone. "Dead people don't judge you, kid. That's why I stayed here." That night I slept on an air mattress on his living room floor, for the first time, without fear. As if the cemetery had adopted me, and maybe it had. 2 days later he offered me a job. Help with the services, you eat, sleep, and learn. I accepted without thinking, and so at 18 I became a gravedigger's assistant. Malcolm taught me everything. Digging, keeping the tombstones clean, dealing with families. He had rules: never disrespect a dead person, never speak loudly near an open grave, never, never bury anything that is not in the coffin. On the 4th night, I heard a voice from outside the house. It was early morning. I went to the window and saw a man standing in front of a tombstone. He had no face, just a black slit where his eyes should have been. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. He raised one of his hands and pointed directly at me, and he vanished. I stayed awake until the sun rose. I told Malcolm the next day. He dropped the shovel and stared at me for long seconds. "You saw it. Now you really belong to the cemetery." That's all he said, but it was enough for me to understand that something had been sealed. The following week, we buried a nameless man. A simple coffin, bought by the city hall. No flowers, no tears, just the two of us. After covering the hole, Malcolm spoke softly. "Funerals without farewells bring company." "Company?" I asked. He nodded. "Lonely dead whisper louder." I laughed. But that night, when I closed my eyes, I heard the clearest whisper of my life. "You are just like me." What kept me there was not the salary, which barely existed, nor the quiet routine. It was the weight of the silence. A silence different from what I knew before. Not the one that makes you feel invisible, but a silence that listens. that observes, that responds. I started having recurring dreams. I was kneeling in front of a shallow grave, and a disembodied voice was saying to me, "Fabiano, you just need to say yes. That's all. Always that." On the morning of my 23rd birthday, Malcolm was waiting for me with a more serious expression than usual. "Today you dig alone." "For whom?" I asked. He handed me the paper. There was no name, just one word. "Receptacle." "Is this a prank?" "No, this is tradition." He sent me to the oldest part of the cemetery where the tombstones had moss and the names were swallowed by time. The section where nobody had buried anyone for decades. I dug, hours, in silence, and deep down, I found something. A black stone object. It shouldn't have been there. A type of small idol, carved with symbols I had never seen. Overlapping circles, eyes without pupils, open mouths. When I touched it, the world seemed to spin. I felt an absurd pressure in my head, as if someone were speaking in a language that only my body understood. I ran to Malcolm with the object wrapped in my apron. He looked at me in silence for a few seconds. Then he said, "It was meant for you. You were the one who found it. Now you need to decide whether you continue to be just a gravedigger or something much bigger." That gnawed at me for days. The idol was hidden in the back of my closet, but I could hear it. A sound of sand running inside a clock, sometimes muffled laughter, others a panting animalistic breath. Until one morning I went to the old section of the cemetery where everything started. I took the idol with me, a handful of black candles, and the book. Yes, the book that appeared days later on the highest shelf in Malcolm's room. Title on the cover, "Born from the Earth That Never Sleeps." No author. It said that certain cemeteries harbor more than bodies, that they are crossing points, that some men, very few, are born marked. Death certificates before even breathing for the first time. I started the ritual. I recited the words with the blood dripping from the palm of my hand. The air changed, and something answered. A figure emerging from the darkness between the tombstones, dressed in clothes that seemed to be made of bones and clay. The face was a mask of cracked wood, but the eyes did not belong to this world. He extended his hand and said, "Fabiano, the cemetery gave birth to you, but the underground claims you." When I touched his hand, I saw everything. I saw my life in reverse. The abandonment, the scars, the well, the screams, the electrician's body. And then I saw the other version of me, the one that stayed on the other side. A Fabiano made of shadow, whispers, and hunger. He smiled, and I understood. It wasn't a pact. It was a return. From that night on, I started digging more easily. I knew exactly where the earth was ready. The cemetery began to obey me. The cemetery was never the same after that night. The trees bowed more to the ground, as if they knew, as if they respected. The air was denser, and the living, the few that still came, left faster. They said the place was different. I was too. Malcolm never asked me what happened that morning, but he started calling me guardian. Not gravedigger. Guardian. He disappeared days later, without warning. I only found a note in the kitchen of the little house near the gates. "You dug to the bottom. Now, you are the bottom." He left the keys. And the book. Alone, I took over everything. Burials, wakes, maintenance, and what was below. Over time, I realized that the cemetery grew by itself. New tombs appeared. Names that I had never seen in any city hall paper. Dates that didn't make sense, as if they pre-existed. I started dreaming about them, not only about the dead, but about the original gravediggers, men covered in clay, digging with their hands, chanting in languages without vowels. And what they buried were not bodies, they were things that should never see the light. One day a woman arrived, tall, sober clothes. She came without a coffin, just an envelope. Inside it, a photo of me, sleeping. On the back, written by hand, "You were born buried. You just didn't know where." She looked at me for long seconds. Then she smiled and said, "You are ready for the second cemetery." I didn't understand. I tried to ask. She just pointed to the ground. "You thought this was the only one." That night, the floor of the old chapel opened. Literally. Stone steps appeared between the cracks. And a smell. It wasn't of death. It was of birth. A kind of life that should never exist. I went down, taking the book, a lantern, and my name. I don't know how long I was there. What I can say is, I didn't come back. Fabiano, the abandoned, the invisible, the beaten, the deceived, the dreamer. He stayed on the surface. What went down was what was always buried. If someone is reading this and thinks they feel the way I felt, before digging anything, make sure it's not your own hole.